Shalom, shalom, my Haverim. Greetings, friends and family. And welcome back, my fellow believers, to Bible and a Bicycle.
How do we maintain a high-order moral orientation in spite of suffering and malevolence? It looks like, we have something difficult to do, as it turns out. That's the religious question, fundamentally, is, well, if you took on all the responsibility you could take on, and you faced everything that you needed to face, what would you be like? Who would you be? And how would the world transform around you? This is an idea that I derived, I would say, in large part from reading Carl Jung. He talked about, psychologically again, about the two great ideas about Christ. There's the idea in John, and that Christ is the Word that was there at the beginning of time and at the end of time. It's this temporally eternal divine Word. There's the divine Word, but there's the incarnation, and the incarnation indicates that the specifics of time and place are just as important as the eternal that surrounds it. And so then I would say, well, that's probably true in each of our lives, is that, well, how do we reconcile this? And well, that's your ethical adventure, how you reconcile that. And we each do it in our own way and with tremendous difficulty, I would say. And we do it aided and abetted, if we're fortunate, by people that love and care for us. But that is the challenge, a huge part of the challenge of life is how do you bear the suffering that is at the crux of life without becoming tempted and embittered. That's really, really difficult. Now, someone might point out, go ahead and be bitter, see where that gets you. And if you have any sense, and generally people have at least some, they know that being sick and bitter is worse than just being sick. But it's very hard temptation to avoid. Sometimes you want to be bitter just out of spite, in some sense, because things are so terrible, all you've got left is your willingness to shake your fist. But we're all stuck with that. And I think we're stuck with it at every level of our life, in some sense, is how do we maintain a high-order moral orientation in spite of suffering and malevolence? It looks like, we have something difficult to do, as it turns out. We might think that we would rather that things were easy and pain-free, and fair enough. But that isn't what our life is like. It's extremely difficult. It's difficult to maintain an ethical orientation in the midst of malevolence and suffering. And that means, in some sense, and I suppose this is part and parcel of the Christian story, that we have some divine calling. And that divine calling is to establish what's good in the midst of what isn't. I don't know exactly what to make of that, because I don't know to what degree we're called on to find Christ in the middle of that, or to be lifted up like that in the middle of that. When you see people who are noble in spite of their suffering, it is ennobling, it is uplifting. Really it is. And it's been striking to me too. People want to be encouraged in that direction. Young people in particular, but not only, come to me and say, look, I've been trying to take on more responsibility and to face the things I've been avoiding, and everything is way better. Then you ask yourself, well, what's the limit of that? Because that's the religious question, fundamentally, is, well, if you took on all the responsibility you could take on, and you faced everything that you needed to face, what would you be like? Who would you be? And how would the world transform around you? And, well, if the partial answer is, well, if I do that a little bit, things get a fair bit better, then the next question might be, well, what if you did that completely? And I don't think that's possible in some sense, right? It's like, perfection is a horizon that always recedes, but it isn't obvious to me what the upper limit of that is. And certainly we do see people, saints, who kind of push the limit, and miraculous things happen around them, maybe in the literal sense, and if not in the literal sense, close enough, for all intents and purposes. And so that's heartening. I tear myself apart about this in many ways, because I think perhaps it's possible to take on too much responsibility and to crush yourself as a consequence. Maybe that's a sin of pride. Who knows? It's certainly possible. But my experience so far has been that when you see people bear their suffering nobly, there's nothing in that but good. That's something. And then when you see people take on more responsibility and decide that they're going to aim up and confront their suffering honestly and forthrightly, that their lives get better and the lives of people around them get better too. And so that's very strange as well, because it also means that the pathway to less suffering is through suffering, right? And that would be hopeful if the world was constituted that way. It's like, well, there's suffering. How do you make it worse? Run away. How do you make it better? Confront it. Yeah, but it's suffering. It's like, yeah, but it's there. There it is. It's right there. It's a precondition for existence or something like that. And it's like you have something important to do as well. And you confront it, and that's the pathway to transcending it. It's rough. If you read anything about Auschwitz, about the Nazi death camps, about what happened in the Soviet Union, if you read that sort of thing seriously, I mean, if you read those accounts and you don't walk away with the notion that evil exists and that the notion of an adversary is like as real as it gets, then you just haven't read very carefully. And the only language that you can really fit that sort of thing in is a religious language. That's the only language that's serious enough. The Nuremberg judgments were the most significant ethical event of the 20th century, or at least among them, because the Nuremberg judgment was that some things are wrong, right? You don't get the excuse, I was following orders. You don't get the excuse, that's how my culture looks at it. You don't get any excuses, that's what a crime against humanity is. It's like, do you believe in crimes against humanity? The answer is either yes or no, because those are the two answers. And if it's no, it's then, okay, you have the world where that's the belief and see how that goes. And I'll have the world where I think that there are things that are evil and we'll see how that goes. It's not like a world where you don't condemn evil. It isn't like there aren't consequences to that decision. Say, I don't believe in evil. It's okay, but that has its consequences. And one of the consequences is you can't condemn evil. That's a problem. And I also think that there's no good where there's no evil. Right? And so if you dispense with the idea of evil, don't you simultaneously dispense with the idea of good? I mean, because if something doesn't exist, how does its opposite exist? And if evil doesn't exist, then how does good exist? Because in some sense, those two things they're integrally linked in their reality. One of them only can't exist, right? That isn't how things work. If there wasn't something that wasn't good, there couldn't be good. And maybe that's the reason there's evil, metaphysically speaking, because you might ask yourself, well, why would God make a world that's characterized by evil? And the answer is, well, maybe evil can exist as a possibility, but not a reality. It could, if we did things right, evil could exist as a possibility and not a reality. Often people are shattered, not because their life is tragic, although that does happen, but because they've been touched by malevolence. Like tragedy in and of itself isn't enough. You can bear a fair bit of tragedy, but if someone had it in for you and, you were betrayed and your life was blown into pieces because of the voluntary betrayal of someone who was aiming at your destruction, and you think, well, that doesn't happen. It's like, yeah, well, you better wake up, because if you're asleep like that, it could easily happen to you. And I wouldn't recommend it, because it happens to people all the time. And sometimes they do it to themselves. And that's brutal. One of the things that the radicals are really good at is weaponizing guilt. And good people have a proclivity for guilt, because if someone accuses you of something, especially if multiple people accuse you, and you're a well-socialized person, a conscientious person, you're going to tear yourself into pieces pretty hard trying to figure out if they've got a point. And that's fine, fair enough. But it makes you vulnerable. This question is, well, how susceptible should you be to accusations? And that's a tough one, because like I said, if you're a good person, it's pretty easy to feel guilty. But the problem with that is your guilt can be weaponized. And that's definitely happening. So all of you people with your privilege, I think part of the reason that there's an injunction, a religious injunction, to atone is to come to terms with your privilege so that it can't be weaponized. It's more complicated than that, but it's a good start. It's like there are all sorts of advantages you have that other people don't have. And no doubt disadvantages as well, right, that are unique to you. But let's stick with the advantages. It's like, well, what makes you deserving of those advantages? And it can't really be historical happenstance. You happen to be born American, which is relatively good fortune, because you can really not attribute that to you. You don't deserve that in any sense. So how do you justify it? And I think the answer is by leading an ethical life. Like, that's actually the answer. It's not like you should lead an ethical life. You should. That's not the issue. The issue is that's how you atone for your unearned privilege. And the advantage to that is your guilt can't be weaponized under those conditions, not by other people, which is very important at the moment, but also by you. It's like you think, well, I've got these advantages. Well, what am I doing about them? I'm doing the best I can with them, right? That's how I justify them, is I try to treat them as gifts, and I try to make the most out of them in a way that's maximally beneficial for me and for everybody else simultaneously. I'm actually trying to do that. It's like, well, who could ask for more than that? And I think that's one weapon in the culture war. It's like, if you're living an ethical life, if you're doing your best, well, maybe you can stop apologizing for your privilege. And maybe that would take one weapon away from the people who want to burn everything down, because they definitely want to burn everything down. It's a call to nobility. It's a call to virtue, fundamentally.
Hope to see you here next time. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. So do I. Now get out from in front of this here screen, and if weather's permitting, go outside, ride your bike, and read your Bible.